What's up, guys? Alexander here with datepsychology.com. Today I want to talk to you guys about competition, specifically female competition. And we're going to be looking at an article with an appropriately titled name, The Development of Human Female Competition. This is a review of literature on female competition, right? Specifically in a mate selection context, but also more broadly, the development of human female competition, the evolution of it, and the way that it is expressed across the lifespan, right? At different ages across the lifespan. This is a paper by Joyce Benenson. She's a evolutionary psychologist, Harvard professor. She researches, as far as I can see from her bibliography, female mating competition, also male mating competition, as well as evolutionary sex differences in mating and relationship behavior, right? So the way that men and women are different evolutionarily and how that is expressed within kind of a mating context. Very common belief, right, in popular culture is that men are much, much more competitive than women. We're going to kind of bring that into question here today. It may not be really what the research shows. What is more likely going on is that men and women are probably equally competitive. Women may even be more competitive, except that we compete in very, very different ways. Men compete in very overt ways. Women compete in concealed ways. So not less competitive, just differently competitive. Preprint of a new paper, if you want to look at some experimental research on that, it's called Intersexual Competition May Be Greater Between Unrelated Women Than Men. One example of many of how women may actually be more competitive than men. So is this kind of a counterintuitive finding? Perhaps on the surface, if we just boil it down to, who's more competitive, it might be. When we look into specific details here, perhaps it will make a lot more sense. Why might men be more competitive? To kind of lay a background here. One reason that would make men more competitive, perhaps, would be greater variation in men's reproductive success, right? Meaning not all men got to mate, more women got to mate. Women have a more equal distribution of offspring. Men, accordingly, not, right? Some men may have many, many more children than others. Some men may have none at all. In mammals, that's not always the case. Females may have greater variation. More females may be excluded. They may be more competitive accordingly. But in the context of competition, women also have similar goals as men. They need to provide resources for themselves and for their offspring. They have to stay physically healthy enough to produce offspring, to lactate, to take care of those offspring, and healthy enough to protect. We often think as men having a specific role as far as protecting offspring. Ancestrally, that very often may not have been the case. Many, many cases where women would have been alone with their child and she would need to fend for them, right? She would need to be able to provide resources and keep it alive. Maybe her mate died. Maybe she's between mates, whatever the case may be. Certainly something that happened many, many times. And so women also share that burden where they need to protect their offspring. They need to provide resources. And at the same time, they have to stay viable to produce future offspring as well. When we talk about competition, it's always in the implied context of cooperation, right? Because typically, if we're not competing, we're going to be neutral or we're going to be cooperating. Many forms of cooperation with one group or one individual may be competition against another. And what we see in human beings, particularly human mothers, is they benefit much, much more from cooperation than most other animals. Certainly more than most other primates, certainly more than most other mammals, right? And what we see in human beings is something called alloparenting, which is taking care of kids that aren't your own. Very uncommon in other animals. Most animals don't do this. Most primates barely do this. In human beings, it's done a great, great deal. Grandmothers take care of children. Female friends take care of children. Men who are not the biological parents even sometimes take care of children. This is very, very unique human behavior. And if we look at some theories around the early ancestral environment, allo mothers probably played a much larger role in childcare even than they do today. Often this would have manifested as kind of a communal female group. In some of the more extreme framings of this idea, it may have even been the case that women lived kind of separately from men, that they took care of their offspring in large groups of communal women and interacted much less with men. This is kind of a controversial idea, so I'm not telling you that this is a fact, but it is one observation, or I should say one hypothesis that is consistent kind of with observations, and that's that big groups of females cooperated to take care of their young, as well as smaller groups of females cooperating to take care of their young. This is related to something as well called the obstetrical dilemma, and what this is basically, how did it come to be the case that women need so much help during childbirth? Very uncommon among most animals that childbirth is so difficult, right? Infant mortality, and not just infant mortality, I should say, maternal mortality, mothers dying in childbirth, very, very high in human beings. It's so high that we have to wonder, wow, this is strange. And it's much higher, much more difficult if a woman does not have help to have a baby, right? Basically, human beings have to have assisted childbirth. That implies that at some point we evolved a great, great deal of cooperation. Probably the two went hand in hand. Without pair bonds between male mates, without great cooperation within the group, this kind of development where women rely so heavily on other women for childbirth probably could not have emerged. And then on top of that, we also have to look at the very long age of gestation, the very, very long juvenile period. What does that mean exactly? Gestation, right? 9 months in the belly. That's a long time, much longer than most animals. The baby comes out and it's flopping around. It's still like a little fetus. It's not really very much quite yet compared to something like a gazelle or a goat, or even not a puppy, I should say. A puppy's pretty poorly developed as well, but a gazelle, it's out, boom, it's running around within 10 hours. And in 2 months, it's basically an adult. A human child is not going to be able to fend for itself in any viable way until it's a teenager, at the earliest, if that. So very, very long juvenile period, very defenseless babies, right? And a very long gestation period. These are all things that require a lot of cooperation and support from other individuals in kind of a communal group. And this kind of cooperation drives competition, right? And our greatest competitors are members of the same sex. Men compete against men, women compete against women. And what we see in the research, starting out for a background here, is that women cooperate much less than men do in groups. And this begins in childhood and persists throughout adulthood. Something we observe that may be kind of counterintuitive. Often we think of women as more cooperative. Men are more cooperative in large groups, and there's an evolutionary basis for this, derived perhaps from hunting and from war, where men had to learn cooperative, pro-social teamwork, basically to defeat other rivals. Women, less so. When women cooperate, it's very much one-on-one behavior, and we will get into that in a little bit going forward. Something related to this, very important. Male hunting success increases fitness for the whole group. When I say fitness, I'm talking about reproductive fitness, which means the survival of offspring. When one male or when a small group of men hunt, they provide resources for the whole group, and that benefits everyone in the group, including men that didn't hunt. It benefits the women and all of that. According to this author, I'll read you a quote. No study has demonstrated the reproductive benefits of cooperation with unrelated women as opposed to female kin. So there's nothing like that for women. There's no form of wide group cooperation, at least that has been demonstrated in the research, that provides benefit for everyone's offspring, right? So when the men of a tribe are successful, everyone benefits. All of the babies benefit. When women are successful collectively, it may have no effect. What's more likely to have effect is the individual relationships of women, one-on-one, for their own offspring, right? Because we're talking about collective fitness of the whole group. Certainly when women cooperate, it benefits their own offspring. Does it benefit the whole group according to this? We don't know that. It has not been demonstrated yet. So, as mentioned in the past slide, this implies that women benefit more from selecting one or two close friends or support individuals. Men benefit more from building coalitions with groups. And this is something that we will see going forward, is that's precisely what women do across all stages of the life, as they pick one or two people to build close relationships with. And additionally, that women invest primarily in their own offspring, their mates, and sometimes their friends or their alloparents, right? Their close allies that would help them raise a child. Men, on the other hand, they distribute resources among the entire group. Men go out and hunt, they kill, the woolly mammoth. Everyone in the tribe gets some, maybe not equally, but everyone benefits. Men go out and raid, they bring back what they got from raiding. Everyone benefits, and this manifests well into modern society, where this kind of giving to the whole tribe benefits everyone in the group. We should look at status as well, because status comes into play and will be an important background for the specific behaviors we look at. So status is something that's very important for the reproductive fitness of men and women, but status is very different for men and women, right? Men and women are different, so are expressions of status for men and women. It's acquired differently as well, and that's something we're going to look into. So women in general, across human society, tend to be seen as lower status than men. And this is true even in the most egalitarian of societies, right? Whatever people may tell you, that's what this evolutionary psychologist says in this paper, that women are going to be lower status even in the most egalitarian of societies. So one of the top ways that women rise in status in any group, in any culture or society, is they form a pair bond with a man. Best way to raise status, or one of the best ways for women in many, many cases. And this is also important because it provides a layer of protection for the woman and for her children. The higher a woman is in status, the less threat there is to her and to her children. Physically, it protects her from physical harm, protects her children from being killed, and that sort of thing. So status has a very important role for women. Maybe we think of status as being more important for men, but it's very, very important for women as well. So women seek status, and the way that they do is going to be different. A lot of these competitive behaviors, you'll see they kind of intertwine with status moving forward. Male status, as mentioned, dependent largely on their role and the benefit they provide to the group. This is why prosocial behavior is so well predictive of status in men. Also why altruistic behaviors are so predictive of status, and perhaps also why those two things are seen as attractive in mates for mate selection, because male status is largely dependent on how they benefit other members of the group and what their role is within that group, how they provide. Female status, on the other hand, is kind of a calculus of her one-on-one relationships with individuals in that group. And this is kind of a give and exchange. It's not just a provision of benefits, but it also comes from punishing other women versus being punished by other women, setting rules for other women that they must follow, or following those rules for less dominant women, including or excluding other women. So they're kind of trying to seek an equilibrium here with these status behaviors. With that background, we can go on. We can look at some principles of female competition, some main principles, and then some ways that those are expressed. 3 principles here, okay? Female competition has to take into account that women must protect their own bodies for lifelong childcare. They can't engage in competition that is as directly aggressive and physical as men can. So when women express competition, it is in ways that reduce their risk of physical harm. The second is the punishment of peers who excel, right? Women benefit less from the cooperative success of the entire group. The strategy is very, very individualist, which means if one person is successful, they may actually be taking away from that woman. It's much more zero-sum than the cooperative male behaviors, which means that women tend to punish peers who excel, right? And the third one is to socially exclude rivals. This is how competition is done. You can't kill off a rival, which is perhaps what men would do, so they socially exclude them, right? Because every additional rival, it's another mouth to feed. It's someone else in the group that could be taking resources that would otherwise be allocated to her and to her offspring. So the strategic social exclusion of rivals is important, and that's something we're going to see a lot of going forward. Of those principles, there's 5 strategies that manifest. And the first one is to avoid interference competition. What this means, because it's kind of phrased strangely, is avoiding physical harm. basically. Disguise competition, number 2. So competition shouldn't be overt most of the case. It should be hidden. It should seem like it is something else. 3, only compete overtly if you are a high rank. So women who are high in status, they can kind of compete overtly, but low-ranking women, got to avoid it. Enforce equality among peers, but avoid for the self. So women are trying to raise in status, but at the same time, they're trying to keep everyone kind of at the same level, right? Because if no one is way above you, if we're all kind of at the same level, that's less of a competitive threat. And the 5th one, use social exclusion upon rivals, right? Rivals, people competing, you try to push them out, cut them out of your life, of the group, of your own interpersonal relationships as much as possible. These 5 strategies manifest differently across the lifespan of women, right? And they start in infancy through adulthood. And you say, did you just say infancy? So you're telling me babies do this. We begin to see kind of the vestiges of this in infants, right? We begin to see these behaviors manifest differently in the behavior of infants, which is something we should expect if these are evolutionary strategies, right? We're talking about something that was selected for. So to some extent, these behaviors are genetic. And that means to some extent, we may begin to see them appearing, as not deliberate strategies, as unconscious strategies in infants. Not very much, but we will mention that, and we will go over the different life stages and how these manifest. Keep these 5 competitive strategies in mind. I will refer back to them. Looking at infancy right now, as I mentioned. Sex differences in survival strategies, already observed in infancy. But in infancy, the largest competitive threat isn't, it's not other babies. You're not going to compete with other babies. It's actually the parents, right? The mother can make it or break it for the baby. Throughout history, infanticide rates, very high, between 10 and 20%. People killed their babies very often. And in many cases, male babies were more desirable than female babies. So this means that, maybe infants, if they behaved in certain ways, those behaviors would have been selected for to make them more desirable babies, right? And that's kind of winning the devotion of the mother, winning her over. Ways that babies may do this. Female babies, they cry less. They have higher emotional regulation. They lash out less. They're less reactive. They're more emotionally stable. They look at their caregiver's face more, and they smile more, and they make more eye contact. So they're engaging in behaviors that may cause a bond, that may cause the mother to be more fond with them. They stay physically closer to the mother, right? So they're less likely to get left behind. They're less likely to be neglected, perhaps again, has a role in that bond. And then by the time they're old enough to start to comply with requests, they do that more than male babies do, right? At about 14 months old here. As far as infancy goes, that's, you can't expect much from a baby. So we'll go on now, and we're going to look at early childhood. This is where we begin to see more obvious kind of competitive strategies between women. First of these, right, anytime we talk about competition, we think about something like physical aggression. And physical aggression peaks at about 2 to 4 years old in children. Girls, of course, are less aggressive. That might be surprising to learn that, 2 to 4 years old is when aggression peaks in humans. We can think of something, for example, like that most violent crime is committed by men when they're between 16 and 24. But even at this age group, men aren't as aggressive as young children are. Young children will just hit you. They will hit each other. You have to teach them, like, don't hit, don't bite, that sort of thing. And this is something they grow out of, but it's an age where they're naturally very, very aggressive. Well, after about 24 months, at that 2-year period, girls are already using less physical aggression than boys. They're less likely to be vocally aggressive as well. This falls into that, avoid interference competition, right? They're avoiding things that could be physically harmful to them. By age 3, we begin to see that girls conceal their behavioral competition as well with non-competitive behaviors, right? Remember the concealment of competition here. So boys, for example, will say, that toy is mine. Girls will say, hey, that toy is mine, right? It's my turn to play with it, right? They'll rephrase it kind of as a question. Boys will say, let's play this game. Girls will say, hey, would you like to play this game? They will you please do this? They will rephrase it. They will put it in a very different way. They want the same goal, right? They're trying to get the same outcome. They're doing it in a very, very different way. So this is probably one example, of why we may think that men are more competitive, that boys are more competitive. Because even though they have the same amount of desire for the same goal, boys are just like, hey, I want it, give it to me. And girls will kind of, find a way around asking for it directly, but they're still putting in the same effort for the same goal, same level of desire. When we begin to see preschool behavior, right, they're interacting with a lot of other children, boys and girls. High status female preschoolers are more aggressive. Remember, they compete overtly when they are high status. That's part of the strategy. So we don't see lower status girls bullying as much. It tends to be high status girls, and that's something we will consistently see across these life stages as well. We begin to see female peer groups actually become less egalitarian than male peer groups at around 4 to 5 years old. Perhaps counterintuitive there as well. We tend to think of, egalitarianism as something that is feminine, that women like. At this age group, women are excluding female peers much more than boys are. Boys are getting everyone to come and play, everyone on the team. Let's get all the boys to play the game. Girls, no. Girls are saying, okay, we're going to pick this group of girls. It's going to be 2 or 3 girls, and we're going to exclude these other people from play completely. High status girls also begin to role play high status roles, right? When children are young, they begin to role play adult behavior. They play house, they play work, they play school and teacher. High status girls, what roles do they pick? I'm the teacher, y'all are the students. So already they're engaging in that behavior where they're setting rules for the other people, and those people need to follow them. Already there's this kind of competitive behavior within the roles that they're playing. By age 3, we begin to see girls disparage or talk poorly of their peers much more than boys do. And this is a behavior, again, that we will see women do more of throughout the lifespan well into adulthood, is that they speak worse of other girls. At this age, they speak worse to other girls as well. That's perhaps another counterintuitive finding. We tend to think of boys as being more rough in the way that they talk, like playfully insulting each other. And people are like, oh, boys, you can say whatever you want to a man. He won't get mad. No, that's not the case. It's actually kind of the other way around. By age 4, girls will form groups of 2 people, and they will exclude other girls for resources, right? Specifically for toys in this case. It's one behavior that's observed. 2 girls will be like, hey, okay, we're going to get together. We're going to take this toy from another girl. Boys don't do that. Boys will just one-on-one, they'll just grab the toy. They won't engage in this more elaborate exclusion to make sure that the other person has no access to it. Perhaps another reason why competition seems higher among boys, even if in some cases it's actually kind of more brutal this way among girls. Imagine if it's just one boy that wants to take the toy, you can kind of fight for the toy and get it back. But if everyone's ganging up on you, that's kind of a brutal expression of competition there, kind of an unfair expression of competition in a way. Moving on, we can look at middle childhood now, and it's going to be ages from about 5 to 12 years old. What we see here is this is when girls really begin to form intimate, solitary friendships with other girls. Different from how boys do. Boys are still prioritizing friendships among the whole group. They will have more friendships, but more shallow friendships, more dispersed friendships. Girls, on the other hand, they're building a friendship typically with one other girl. A very intimate friendship, a much closer one. And when those friendships end, it's much more emotionally devastating for them as well. They isolate themselves from other girls in these friendships, and boys don't do that. So although these friendships are much closer emotionally, they're also much less likely to last. And what that means is that girls are getting in these very intimate friendships. They're basically breaking up, kind of traumatically, and they're going on and they're making another intimate friendship with another girl. They kind of go from one friend to another. Boys a little bit less that way. So this means that a great deal of competition at this age range is centered around finding a friend, right? Finding a friend, taking a friend from another girl, and that sort of a thing. They're like I mentioned, they're more likely to break up. They tolerate less, and so they break up more with their friends and they find new friends. At this age range, they continue to use less direct competition, and the competition continues to be less risky. We see that in kind of the social competitive behaviors that exist in that school environment, right? Women are more likely to compete in a single person sport, one that is not competing directly against another woman, or against other women in a team. Boys are more likely to compete in sports that compete against another boy, or particularly in team sports. Another way that women compete more than men do, starting at this age, is in academics, right? Women, girls outperform men, and then on into womanhood, continue to outperform men all the way through university. You know, we see it now that women graduate more, attend university more, and so on. So academics seem to be an example of how women really like to compete without competing against any one specific individual. Part of this also is that women, when they compete, they tend to compete kind of against their past performance more than men do. So in academics, you can always study more, right? But there's not another individual that you're going up head to head against in most cases. If you get an A on the test, you know, maybe you've beaten a lot of other people in the class, but it's not like one specific person that you're trying to beat the score of. The score is already predetermined, and you either do better than your past performance, or you meet that standard, or you don't. Something else about that, when girls compete, again, they continue to use less competitive language. That's something we saw almost as soon as girls began to speak, right? And you see they use it about half as often. They use kind of inclusive or affiliative language more as well. This is also the age where, despite using less competitive and assertive language, we really begin to see gossip begin to show up frequently. Girls report spreading much more rumors. This is kind of that behind the back competition, right? And this is one of the big ways that we're going to see going forward that girls and women compete with other girls and women. We continue to see bullying, again, from the high-ranking girls. And this always takes the form, I say always, but mostly takes the form of high-ranking girl bullying a low-ranking girl. You know, it's not usually girls in the middle getting bullied or bullying. Very much kind of this back and forth between high and low rank. We also see here, again, pro-social dominance, right? And that's that high-status girls try to get into high-status positions so that they have authority over other girls. If you remember the preschool example, right? Girls would role play being in a position of high authority. Now they're getting old enough where they might get some middling authority, and the high status girls seeking out those positions of power. What we see here also is the enforcement of equality, that girls begin to denigrate superior girls. What does that mean? That girls in a group that are not the high status girl, sometimes they can kind of band together and they will kind of try to take that high status girl down a notch, right? And related to that, girls value less apparent outward competitiveness. When they see a woman who is excelling a little bit more, they kind of want to take that down. Boys are very much the opposite in this case. What boys do is they prefer to play with high status boys, more competitive boys. Boys, when they see a high status peer, they think, I want to be his friend. I want to emulate that. I want to, kind of get into that social group. Women, it's almost the opposite. They see a high status girl and they think, we got to get her out of that spot. We got to make her equal. We got to bring her down to our level in that sense. When playing the same games, sports, that sort of thing, girls won't keep score as much. Boys will, right? So say you're playing hopscotch or handball, or you're playing football or basketball. Girls will be like, let's just play. And boys will want to keep score. So that's something else. And if score is kept, when girls win, when girls are victorious, they express more discomfort over it, right? This is all related to that enforcement of equality. Girls don't want to stand out and be the tall poppy because they know that the tall poppy gets cut. So they're kind of uncomfortable when they win, when they get into that victorious point of view. We begin to see more social exclusion at this age range, right? Female friends form groups to reject a lone girl. It's a pattern that we've seen before. It intensifies. But that lone girl is often depicted as being superior seeming, right? We'll see that later as well. You ask, like, hey, why are you picking on this girl? Oh, she thought she was all high and mighty. That's kind of a justification that's used. So often they're forming these groups to kind of exclude someone because they see that person as a threat, right? It's where we begin to see at this age the first competition for boyfriends as well, right? Girls excluding other girls because they think that he's trying to take my boyfriend. Very young girls at this point, and also women leaving their male friends to be with a boyfriend or a male interest much earlier. Boys typically are not doing it at this age yet, pretty young here, but girls are already kind of starting to do that with their very young romantic interests on the playground. Now, getting into the last stages here, adolescence and adulthood. And what we're looking at here are behaviors that begin to manifest in the teens to the adults, right? So we're treating this kind of as one group. That's how it was treated in the paper. I think because, as she mentioned in the paper, about half of all women get married worldwide before the age of 18, right? In the West, we tend to think of 18 as, you know, the dividing line between adulthood, good age in my opinion, but in the rest of the world, many places in the world, adulthood is much younger. In the prehistoric environment, probably it would have been much younger that they began to select mates as well. So this is kind of what we see. And in adolescence, when this mate selection begins to occur, allegiance switches in women between friends to their new mate, right? So there's incentive to become even more competitive with female peers at that point. Nonetheless, the closest allies of women remain the family. Women continue to view family as more important than their friends. And this is something, you know, that, and they continue to spend more time with their family as well, which might seem kind of strange, you know, more time with their family than with their spouse, perhaps for viewers that are American and that sort of thing. But if you're European or if you're like Latino or something like that, maybe it's less counterintuitive because you will have seen like, she spends so much time with her family. It's incredible. So family continues to remain important throughout the lives of adult females, but friendships much, much less. And thus, this is where we begin to see competition between women for other mates. And this is also when we begin to see that most competition between women may be boiled down to competition between other mates. The author in this paper says 91% of competitive acts averse, you know, another woman for a mate reason. So kind of a high number there, that so much competition is oriented around that mate-seeking behavior or excluding other women. We can look at some of these principles now and how they manifest at this adulthood, this teen to adulthood stage, right? So as far as avoiding interference competition goes, women are playing even fewer zero-sum games in sports. If women played more sports as a younger girl, getting older, they're playing less. So that declines. Physical aggression declines, you know, and this is actually the age, teens to adults, where physical aggression in men is starting to go up a little bit, you know, most violent crime. The opposite for women, boom, it's going down a little bit. So less aggression, right? Because avoid interference competition. They're getting big enough now where physical aggression could be very harmful. It could have, you know, lasting effects, kill their offspring, damage them permanently. Avoiding physical aggression, very, very important. Disguising competition. So we're looking at young adults here. They're much, much more clever. And so competition is very, very well disguised. Quotation from the author here. She says, competition is disguised so thoroughly that the competitors themselves are not even conscious that they're competing. Something to consider when we think of men as being more competitive than women. It may just be because female competitiveness is so incredibly well disguised, we often miss it. We often overlook kind of what is really going on there. Major interference with other girls' romantic relationships. That's going to be the big, big way that women compete with other women at this point, right? Because most of that competition is related to mating in some way. One of the big ways that women compete. And the big way that women do this is through gossip, which has been a consistent pattern from a young age to adulthood, as we see. And one of the main ways that women do that through gossip is the denigration of the sexual reputations of other women, slut shaming, probably the most common. This may be surprising to people who are coming from this topic from a point of view of like the manosphere and feminist discourse online, which would kind of make you think that it's mostly men slut shaming women. In real life, that's not the case. It's mostly women interacting with other women. They're the ones setting the sexual taboos. They are the ones slut shaming other women. Anyone out there watching this who has a daughter, for example, you probably know that most of the bullying occurs from other women on the playground, that sort of thing. So in real life, mostly coming from other women. The internet discourse on slut shaming may make it seem like it's men often, but in real life, mostly it's kind of women doing this to other women. And even if we look at the origin of many, many taboos across history, and there's probably another, don't want to digress too much into this, a lot of those social norms were kind of enforced by women. So what we see at this point also, going from young adulthood into adulthood, teens to adulthood, is that records of conversations show that women use negative language about other women much more. Women speak poorly about other women more than boys do about other boys. Yet when women are denigrated directly, they respond more positively to that, right? So they're trying to diffuse competition. They're trying to avoid a direct competition, right? Because that's a principle we have seen throughout this, is that female competition is always kind of on the side. It's always trying to sidestep direct competition. At the same time, something that may be kind of counterintuitive here is we often tend to say like, oh, you can insult a guy, guys will insult each other back and forth, they don't care. No, you insult a guy, I mean, you might get hit in the face. Men fight over small insults if they're not jokes. Women won't. So something to consider there. For the high-ranked, bullying continues. It continues on into adulthood. And we also see at this point heightened competition to form friendships with high-status peers. And that also means higher incentive to denigrate high-status peers. And as I mentioned in the past, the primary justification for this is they say, she was acting superior. She was being too high and mighty. So when women collectively denigrate other women, it's because they are high status, or they are perceived as high status, or at least that is being used kind of as an excuse for that bullying. They're trying to pull them down. They're trying to enforce kind of this inequality, but at the same time, they are trying to get higher status themselves. So it's kind of finding that equilibrium, trying to reduce the threat of other high status individuals while at the same time becoming more high status. And one way this manifests is that low status girls will surrender other friendships for a high status peer, right? So they're more likely to break up with their friend for a cooler new friend. We can look now into the conclusion, some big take-home points, and then we can kind of go over some other things that this makes me think about. Female competitive strategies. Take-home point here. They're all derived around the need to maintain physical health, right? They're not going to be physical. They're going to be things that don't directly threaten her ability to reproduce, take care of offspring, or that directly threaten the survival of her children. Only when women are high status can they compete openly against other women. So almost all competition is going to be concealed. It's not going to be obvious. If you want to see it, you have to kind of look for it, right? High status. Why? Because being high status probably buffers them against similar direct threats, right? If you're high status enough, they can't retaliate in a directly physical way that's going to damage you or damage your child. So girls try to reduce competition by demanding equality. Interesting motivation for equality. Why the desire for equality here? To reduce competition. So they're trying to pull down the high status girls, but at the same time, they're trying to ally with high status girls. They're trying to get a little bit high status themselves, but they want to pull the tall poppies down at the same time. And one of the main ways that women are going to be doing this is through social exclusion. It's going to be almost entirely verbal, right? It's going to take the form of gossip, of denigrating other women, and a lot of that is going to be related to the sexual behaviors of other women. So some final thoughts going over here, things to contextualize this, right? To relate it to other things out in the world. So we think of men as more competitive. I've mentioned this many, many times. Probably women are just as competitive, if not more so, except that they compete in a very, very different way. Okay, they're not going to get into a fight in the middle of the street, but they may go out of their way to ruin another woman's life. So does that mean that men are more competitive because they will get in a physical fight, and that women are less competitive because they will gossip and like ruin someone's reputation? Is one more or less competitive? Probably, not. I mean, you could probably argue that the female expression is more damaging in that specific example. So there's a lot of ways as well why men would be more competitive, a good evolutionary background from that, something I described at the beginning of the video. The relationship between hunting and resource providing and war would be selective pressures for male cooperativeness that did not exist for women, and additionally, the fact that those contributions of Male cooperativeness contribute to group fitness, but those of female cooperation among the whole group do not. So interesting as well to think we think of men as being more cooperative, or excuse me, as more competitive, when the evolutionary basis or background for that tells us, actually we should expect men to cooperate more. Maybe we just don't see the way that men are really good at cooperating oftentimes. In past research, specifically research into personality psychology, we see that women are more egalitarian. Women support egalitarian ideals, ethics, egalitarian politics, political parties, They support this more than men do. We tend to think of this as, and certainly the way that it is depicted, as kind of an altruistic behavior, a caring behavior, and all of that. Might not be, might just be a strategy to pull other people down to the same level. Pessimistic interpretation there, but certainly one that would be consistent with all of this research, that women seek to make other women equal as a competitive strategy. Is the female expression for a greater egalitarian preference part of that? I mean, you tell me, but certainly it is plausible. Something else to consider in the big cultural debate, political debate, all of that sort of thing. We very often talk about individualism versus collectivism. But as we see from all of this research cited in this paper, women seem to have a much more narrow focus on themselves as an individual and then the immediate individuals around them. Husband, offspring, self, immediate friends, or allo parents. Men, on the other hand, have a much wider focus on groups. Might not always be apparent because women are very social, right? Women have a one-on-one relationships. That's how they rise in status. And that may make women more emotionally intelligent, so to speak. It may make women better verbally. It may make them better at building these kind of close, intimate relationships. But it's important not to understand, or excuse me, it's important not to mistake that individual relationship building as a real expression of desire for a collective good or collectivism. Kind of related to that individual versus group benefit, the actual male behavior in many ways may actually be more collectivist, and the actual female behavior may be more individualist. Of course, this will vary, but again, something else to think about. When we look at these competitive strategies, right? Denigration of other women was the main competitive strategy, the main form of gossip and tearing other women down. Try to think about how many taboos are out there created by women and enforced upon other women. In the discourse recently, something I have seen very popularly is age gap relationships. Women shaming other women for engaging in age gap relationships. What is an age gap relationship? Well, it is a relationship between two adults. I'm talking about adults here, not children. Two adults where one is much older than the other. So a lot of taboos around that enforced by women, a lot of discourse from women for different reasons, kind of shaming women for that. Slut shaming other women. Women do it more than men do, at least in real life. Whatever you've seen online, in real life, women are mostly interacting with men, and they're the ones trying to ruin other women are mostly interacting with other women, and they're the ones trying to ruin the reputations of other women using this as a tactic. Something I talked about in a past video, and we can tie this in here as well. Women are actually more likely than men slightly to be pro-life. In a past video, I discussed how pro-life beliefs have actually been linked to a desire to control reproductive competition. Same with a bunch of other behaviors like drug use. Might be kind of controversial because certainly people have different ideas as far as that debate on, if a fetus is a person and that sort of thing, religious beliefs. But that's, again, what we see in psychology is that these pro-life beliefs may actually be motivated by a desire to control the reproductive strategies of other women. So women might see women they see as promiscuous and think, these women should have some kind of consequence. They should take care of that baby and settle down with a single man. Why? Because it takes them off of the market, right? They're less of competition for other mates at that point. And that is it, guys, the end of the video. So If you have questions or comments, leave them down below. If you like the topic, let me know. If you want to hear more topics, if you have an idea for one, leave a comment also. And as always, like the video, subscribe to the channel. Hope to talk to you guys again very, very soon.